All right, so welcome, and let's start today's stream. So welcome to this first episode of our live stream series, where we will talk a little bit about Bicep. Now, if you've never heard about Bicep, if you have no clue what it is, you should not worry too much, because this today is actually the perfect episode to start your Bicep journey. We will really introduce you to Bicep, what it is, and then throughout the series, try to lift your Bicep skills from level 0 or something up to level 300, so that you will then be ready to use Bicep in your environments yourself. So for your information, this session will be recorded and will be published well, as soon as possible after the stream. And just for your information, we had a similar series last year where we covered several ARM templates topics. So if you missed that series, the link to the recordings will be in the slide deck that you will get after the show as well. All right, if you have any questions during the webinar, feel free to use the Q&A section, and we will try to take care of all of your questions. And we'll also have some time at the very end to discuss your questions specifically. All right, so let's quickly introduce ourselves, and I'll hand over to Martin first.
Thank you, Marcel. So my name is Martin Ernst, and I work for a company in Norway called Vipps. We are a payment platform and an identity platform. So if you live in Norway or close to Norway, you have probably heard of it. I also, in my spare time, like to race cars and ski big mountains. So that's my quick introduction.
Great, thank you, Martin. And some words about myself. So my name is Marcel. I'm an Azure MVP and Regional Director operating out of Switzerland. I work for SoftwareOne. We are a technology services company, and we help customers with everything on their way or on their journey to the cloud and towards digital transformation. All right, so let's talk a little bit about Bicep and why it's actually used. So Bicep is somehow used together with the Azure platform. And if you ever worked with Azure, you might have heard of this term ARM or Azure Resource Manager. That is actually our, let's say, consistent management layer that takes care of all the modification that happen in the Azure environment. So that means whenever we do something on the Azure platform, no matter if we are actually using the Azure portal, if we're using whatever the Azure CLI, or if we use PowerShell scripts, or if we talk to some REST APIs or whatever, everything goes through ARM. And ARM as a consistent management layer takes care that we're properly authenticated, that we get the permissions and proper authorization to the services that live on the Azure platform. And it allows us to, well, deploy new services if you want that, such as virtual machines or such as databases, those kind of things. It allows us to get data, to modify data, and so on. So everything goes through ARM. ARM ensures that our experience is consistent no matter what tools we are using. We have always the same permissions. We are actually governed by the same policies, etc. All right, and now what you see here in the slide on the bottom right, you see a thing called ARM templates. So this is around for a long time already, because Azure Resource Manager templates allow us to somehow follow a declarative approach to describe infrastructure and services to then deploy those services to the Azure platform. So instead of deploying stuff manually, or instead of using an imperative scripted approach, we can use ARM templates and use a declarative approach where we describe the actual end state of our infrastructure or application. And then we can hand over this declarative configuration to the Azure Resource Manager, which will then take care of all the rest. So that means Azure Resource Manager will analyze the existing environment and will find out what needs to be changed to make our configuration that we described with ARM templates happen. Right? So it will initially provision the service, Or it will also find out if certain components are already existing in our environment. So that maybe not everything needs to be redeployed, but existing services might need to be changed just a little bit, right? And I think that's a very important concept to understand. So ARM templates are not only used for initial provisioning, but also then for the full life cycle of an application or a service. Because if we need to make configuration changes on that service, if we need to extend the configuration or add additional services, we can go back to our initial configuration file and just extend or change what should be extended or changed, and then hand over the same configuration file again. And Azure Resource Manager will recognize that maybe just some minor modifications are needed to an already existing service. So we'll lift our service from, let's say, version 1 to version 2 without full reprovisioning. And that also means that this ARM template is then automatically also our, let's say, service description or service documentation. So this is has been around for a long time already. And if you ever used to work with ARM templates, you know that, well, this works perfectly, but ARM templates are a little bit complex. They use a JSON format, and that means that we end up with lots of commas, parentheses, brackets, and so on. And depending on the complexity of an ARM template, it can become kind of complicated to read, right? And I mean, JSON originally was never meant to be human readable, but it's still kind of human readable. And now, how do we deal with this complexity? So until now, we just had to manage it somehow. But then Microsoft came up with something new, which is Bicep now, which is kind of a new domain-specific language, or short DSL. And the goal behind Bicep is that we can simplify this coding process so that we can somehow get away from this JSON complexity, to reduce complexity, to make it readable or better readable, and also to remove code, so to somehow simplify our full coding experience, right? Now, what does that mean? That doesn't not mean that ARM now can somehow consume Bicep files. That will not work. So ARM is still working with ARM templates, but Bicep is kind of an additional abstraction layer that allows us to describe our service, and then our Bicep configuration file will be compiled into an ARM template, and then it's still the ARM template that is then handed over to the Azure Resource Manager. So ARM templates are still around, JSON is still around, but if you use Bicep properly, you will probably never see ARM templates again. If we take a look at the schema, how this looks like, this is what we had until now. So when we wanted to describe infrastructure as code, we created an ARM template, and then somehow handed this over to the Azure Resource Manager, and the Azure Resource Manager, well, either deployed the appropriate Azure resources or updated existing Azure resources based on our configuration. And that will still stay the same, as I mentioned. But what happens now is that we get this additional abstraction in front of the ARM templates box here, which means that we can now start creating Bicep configuration files, which are far easier to create, understand, read, and write. And then we compile our Bicep configuration files into ARM templates, and then the rest of the process is exactly the same. Now, to make this experience very, very simple, we can do all of this in one step now. So starting with a specific Azure CLI version or PowerShell, no matter what you prefer, we can now do this in one single step. So that means we can create a Bicep file and then deploy that Bicep file directly to Azure. In the backend, it will still compile to an ARM template, and then the ARM template is handed over. But for us, this is a transparent process. We just care about Bicep files. But it also means if you are keen to see the result of your Bicep configuration file compilation, you can still have a look at the produced ARM template and use that. So what does it mean now from a tooling perspective? Well, to start using Bicep, there's two tools, or let's say extensions, that you might find very helpful. So the first one is the Visual Studio Code extension that allows you to create, write, edit, read Bicep configurations. So if you use Visual Studio Code, this is very much suggested to use, because it definitely helps you. It gives you this IntelliSense kind of thing. It analyzes the quality of your Bicep file, analyzes the syntax and all of that stuff, and gives you this very good authoring experience. And once we have created our Bicep file, we then need to compile it into an ARM template and then deploy it to Azure. And for that, there's this so-called Bicep CLI. And this is available in two versions. So it's either available in a standalone version, or there is also an Azure CLI integrated version. So if you want to use this fully transparent experience that I mentioned before, you should use the Azure CLI integrated version, because from there you can directly deploy Bicep files to Azure without even recognizing that an ARM template has been created in the backend. All right. So the Bicep CLI does that compilation to an ARM template. And what's also very nice, the Bicep CLI can also decompile ARM templates. So that means you can take an existing ARM template that you might have created in the past. And from there, you can now decompile that into a Bicep configuration file. So Bicep CLI actually supports the build or compilation, or also the decompilation process. So it goes into both directions, and this is very, very helpful if you want to start building your own, let's say, Bicep repository or Bicep library. You can still use the investment you have already done in ARM templates, decompile all of that, and then maybe with some very minor changes, start creating your Bicep repositories. All right. So lots of talking, and now we want to see Bicep in action, what it actually means. And for that, I will hand over to Martin.
Thank you, Marcel. I'm just going to share my screen quickly. Then we can go through whatever we have. So you should see my screen now. And like Marcel talked about, is the reason why we have Bicep now is that Microsoft has now acknowledged that the community says these ARM template stuff is quite complex. We also had a series last year where we talked about all the bells and whistles on ARM templates. So, but since we now can, since now Bicep is in parity with ARM templates, we can now focus on learning Bicep instead of ARM, hopefully. I'm not sure if you can exclude your ARM template knowledge just yet, but hopefully pretty soon. So the first thing I have done is that in VS Code, which is my preferred tool to work with the Bicep files, I have this extension called Bicep. So this is a extension which you add into Bicep, which will then go through your files and see that, okay, this is a Bicep file, and then I can use all the functionality which is inside this extension. So for example, autocomplete and those kinds of stuff. So I have installed Bicep as well, and then I believe the is a Bicep version work. So I have Bicep CLI 0.4, which is, I believe it is the latest one. I haven't seen any announcement on 0.5 being announced yet. So that means I'm in parity with ARM, and I am actually ready to use Bicep for production environments. Last year when we talked briefly about Bicep in our ARM template series or infrastructure as code on Azure series, Bicep was in 0.1 and was really at a beta or alpha stage at that point, but now we are good to go. So apart from installing the extension and installing the Azure CLI, then we can, or when we have that installed, we can start to explore all the things that we have with Bicep. So the first thing that we notice is it looks a little bit different than we had with ARM. So let's just take a look at one ARM template to see how that looked back in the days. So this is raw kind of JSON, and then we have all these brackets and the stuff that we, without having complex templates, last year, for example, before Bicep, then we needed to care about these brackets and so on. But with Bicep, that's almost gone. So now we have to write less lines of code to do the same. This is one example that I have, which is the minimum you need to write to have a storage account created. So it just takes the name and location and all the properties that is needed for Bicep. Bicep works a little bit different. So now that I have this extension installed with VS Code, I can start typing in resource, for example, and then it will try to autocomplete the things that I'm looking for. So RES, of course, is a resource, and in Bicep I need to define that I need a resource, and then I need to put in, let's say, let's call it a friendly name. So this is only used within Bicep. We are going to look at that a little bit later in the series, where we can reference stuff within modules and within the same template and so on, but you need to have a friendly name for the resource. And then we are, let's use the autocomplete function again. So a resource with resource with defaults, then it will set the defaults that we always need for deploying resources. So if let's say I want to deploy a NSG, I can just call it, for this demo, I can just say there's a friendly name NSG, and then it will also autocomplete the resource provider type that we have. So there's probably under network, right? Network. Network security groups. So it will autocomplete wherever it finds necessary. So go to a security group, and then it will prompt us for what API version I want to use. I'll choose the latest. And then the name is something, and then it's a string. And the location is West Europe, or Norway East in this case. So with it knows that I want to deploy a network security group, then it also knows that I want to add in security rules. And then we can continue to build upon that functionality with auto completion that this extension has. So it's pretty easy to get started now in a part where it was not that easy in the ARM template area. Just take a quick look at my notes. So that's how we basically get started with Bicep in the first place. Like Marcel said, it builds like an abstraction layer of ARM, and we can always take a look at how these two small demos will work. So let's take a look at the demo 2 here. So just to make it a little bit more complex, so to speak, we will go through all these complexity that you can add to Bicep later, but in this example I have added in a parameter, and I will use this parameter for the storage account name, and I will also add in a storage container. So what you see here is that I'm actually referencing the friendly name and the name, and saying that this container belongs to the storage account that we are deploying. So it's an implicit dependency, and I'm going to show you how much more code that small part is in ARM template compared to Bicep. So you don't have to do this, but if you want to, you can take a look at it. But like Marcel said, this will deploy as a Bicep file directly to Azure. But let's see, if we right click on the file, we can then go to build, and then it will create the JSON equivalent of our Bicep file, which is an ARM template. And then you can see, apart from this metadata, this is what you will need to write. So it's a little bit more complex. You have to set the dependency. This is an explicit dependency. So in Bicep it will just a reference to the name, but in ARM templates it was a more complex scenario to reference where the container will be deployed, or to what storage account the container will be deployed to. And also the parameter section is a little bit more not complex, but it's a little bit more to type. This was 38 lines, and my demo was 20, or less than that, because there are actually white spaces in between here. Let's just delete that before I commit. So that's what we can compile to ARM, but we can, like Marcel said, we can also decompile an existing ARM template. So if we, let's say we try to use one of the files that we had last year, Marcel, I'm not sure how they will work, but let's try. So AC Bicep decompile, so that means that we will decompile the ARM template to a Bicep file. So if we take one of the more complex stuff that we used last year, let's see, it was templates. Then it should, of course, it will say something about an error, but I'm not sure. This is somewhat an experimental feature, but I've seen it work for less complex ARM templates. But once we are linked, there's probably some links that are not relevant or does not work anymore in this template file. So it sees it has some errors specific to the file path. Okay, but if we look at the file that we use, so Azure deploy.json, it was around 100 lines of code, and the Bicep file is 48. And that's with all the link deployments that we had in this quite complex linked ARM template with a lot of information that we need to and references and so on. So 50% reduced or something like that. But just to prove that it works, I can try to deploy this Bicep file. Of course, I will need a resource group that I don't remember the name of. So now it reads my template and it asks for a storage account name, which I will just put in something that I hope no one else uses. And then I will hit enter, and in the backend now it will translate this into an ARM template and send it out to Azure Resource Manager. We can probably take a look at deployments here, and it will see that earlier or yesterday my deployment failed, but today I have demo 2 deploying, and this is a storage account. That works. So if I want to change something in the storage account, I can do that in this template and then redeploy. So that's my first demos of this, or at least these are the demos. Unless somebody has some questions that they would like to answer, then we can probably show something. But if you wait a couple of weeks, we will cover everything from A to Z about Bicep, I believe. Marcel?
Yep, awesome. Thanks. To Bicep and the relevant tooling. And I think what we learned is that Bicep definitely helps to remove complexity, to enhance the readability of our configuration script, and at the very end, it makes us faster, and it also enhances, obviously, the quality of our deployments. All right, so let me share my screen again. Go back to the slides. You should see that now, I assume. All right. Good. Yeah, as we've seen, Bicep is very easy to learn, so you can really start your Bicep journey today. Download the relevant tools or extensions so that you can start using it. Just some additional inputs. If you use Bicep CLI, ensure that you are running version 0.4 or someday higher versions, of course, because this gives us parity with ARM templates and is also supported by Microsoft for production deployments. I think that's very important to keep in mind. We specifically try to keep these webinar episodes short, so 30 minutes, so that we have some more time at the end for Q&A. Until then, two more things while you are preparing your questions. If you're interested in the webinar recordings from last year, so if you also want to dig into ARM templates a little bit more, go to this URL. It will forward you to a playlist that contains, I'm not even sure, 5 or 6 recordings about ARM templates or infrastructure as code in general. Also very interesting. And finally, we received this last minute. There's obviously that new cloud challenge that you can participate in. You can earn a badge, and finally, you can also win like cool, nice gadgets, some swag, whatever it is. I don't know, stickers, bags. You can see it here. Definitely make sure that you also take this challenge. It will not take you too long, but you qualify for a badge and for some swag. All right, and then finally, just as an information for our next streams. So this was the first one today, the introduction to Bicep. And Martin said that in the next streams we'll also focus like on more specific features. So September 8th, we'll focus on everything parameters, variables, functions, those kind of things, so that you can learn a little bit how this works in Bicep. September 22nd, we'll talk about more complex deployments, advanced structures, and we'll also show you how Bicep modules can be used to even more simplify your deployments. And then in October, or on October 6th, we will talk about bringing Bicep configuration files into structured release pipelines. So this is what you can expect to come in the next week from us. And that said, yeah, we still have some more minutes for questions. So if you have something, feel free to use the Q&A window. If you don't have anything to ask, I'd like to say thank you for attending, and hopefully you'll be back in 2 weeks for the next episode. Thank you very much.
Yeah, Marcel, if there isn't any questions, maybe we can just talk a little bit about Bicep, if you want.
We can. Go ahead.
So just let's do the video thing, shall we?
Yeah, sure.
So do you run Bicep in production now?
Well, we have several customers that are now starting their Bicep journey because it wasn't production ready yet. They were, of course, like testing or use Bicep in POCs, but we are now actually slowly transitioning all our customers to really use Bicep also in their production environment. But it takes some time. I mean, all the investments, all, let's say, the deployment strategies, they need to be it needs some rethinking before you can really just then switch to Bicep. What we definitely do is that we definitely suggest to use Bicep for every new DevOps or infra as code customer. Yeah.
Yeah.
What about yourself?
Well, I kind of come from service provider background where we managed all customers, but now I'm in sort of not internal IT, but I'm in a platform-based company where we build all our tools ourselves, or the platform ourselves, and we are actually moving from somewhat self-developed tools and also a little bit that we experiment a little bit with Pulumi earlier, and we are trying to transition everything that my team does into Bicep now, just to see if it works. And for now we have around 100 modules and a couple of thousand or multiple thousand lines of code, and it seems to work pretty good. Once it was in 0.4, it was way better than earlier.
All right, so you had a very good experience. What about your team? So when they started using Bicep, was it like no big deal for them to actually learn it?
Well, my team consists of pretty code knowledgeable individuals, but it's and some of them have been using Terraform earlier, and some of them are using C# from day to day. So then it was easy for them, but in comparison with JSON ARM templates, it's a lot easier to get started. That's for sure.
Hopefully, it's not becoming too easy, so that they still have a little bit of a challenge when they are coding services.
Yeah, we will cover this later, but the Bicep files get complex as well when we are talking about modules, looping, references, everything like that. So then it will be complex.
Absolutely, and yeah, we're really much looking forward to also cover these topics in the next episodes.
I do not see any questions, so we could wrap this up.
I think so. Yeah. So let's wrap this up. Well, I also already said the thank you and goodbye words, so I will leave it to you now.
Yeah, that's perfect. Thanks to everyone who participated, and we'll see you on the next one.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.